So good evening. Welcome to the Dusty Feet. Tonight will be fun, at least for me anyways. I hope you enjoy it too. We're going to cover part 3 in the Exodus Q&R. We're actually going to get to 2 questions tonight, which will be great. And then a clip from somebody that we've heard from, but you haven't seen yet. So that'll be interesting. We should enjoy ourselves. And don't forget, in the description below are links to all of the video, audio, and source documents that we use here on the Dusty Feet. Want to make sure that any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, the learning we do here does not happen. So please be sure to click to subscribe. And as always on the Dusty Feet, this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God, interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So here we go with some more Bible Project on the Dusty Feet. Okay, so like I said, we're going to get into the 2 questions, a couple rabbi trails most likely, introduced to somebody that you haven't seen before, you've heard before, but you haven't seen before, and we'll enjoy. Again, we'll continue with pickup in the podcast. We'll pick up where we left off and start answering some questions, or at least not answering, responding, listening, and learning as we continue here.
Okay. We got some questions to get to.
Totally. Okay. That was a good conversation. Let's move into some audience question and response, shall
These
we?
will all be easy, I'm sure.
Oh, man. No, they're such good questions. You guys, first of all, all of you listening, you're amazing. And the questions you send in are so insightful. I love it. I wish I could transcend my finite capacity and like have a cup of coffee with everybody who listens to the podcast. That would be so fun.
Everyone actually wishes that too.
I would say I would never get to actually like be a father to my sons if I did that and have a job. So, but we can do this. So first question we want to respond to is from Terry Evans in Georgia.
Hey, Tim and John, this is Terry Evans from Woodstock, Georgia, and I have a question about the possible connection between the Exodus narrative and the story of Jacob's burial in Genesis 50. In his book, The Exodus You Almost Passed Over, Rabbi David Foreman highlights the similarities in language between these 2 stories, and he makes a case that the combined Israelite-Egyptian procession that is described in Jacob's burial gives us a portrait of what the Exodus could have looked like if Moses as Pharaoh would not have been so defiant and unwilling to acknowledge Yahweh's authority. Do you guys see a connection between these 2 stories? And if so, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how Jacob's burial should inform our reading of the Exodus narrative. Thanks, guys.
Wow.
You see what I'm talking about?
Yeah, seriously.
That's such a great question. Such a great insight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the deep end of the pool.
Totally.
Right there.
All right. So, my first response is yes and yes. First, think about scroll technology.
Mm-hmm.
That the whole thing about Genesis 50 is Joseph going to Pharaoh and making a request to leave the land, to go up from the land, and to bury his father. And the wording of that request is the wording precisely of the repeated requests.
To go into the wilderness and
Moses is constantly going before Pharaoh to ask to leave the land.
Mm-hmm.
But what God says is I'm going to do is to bring them up out of the land.
Okay.
That's one thing. So a request to Pharaoh to leave the land with the goal of going up out of the land. That's one parallel. Second is it's Pharaoh and Pharaoh.
Yeah.
The other is that Jacob makes his sons swear a covenant oath that they will take him up to the land of Canaan to bury him. Genesis 50 ends with Joseph making his brothers swear a covenant oath that they will take his bones up out of the land. And at the end of the Exodus narrative, in Exodus 13, there's a little note that says, and when the Israelites went up out of the land, they took the bones of Joseph with them. So the two Exoduses from the land are parallel, but they're contrast stories. So it's a contrast between when you have a king of the nations who blesses God's blessed one, you get blessing. And the good Pharaoh at the end of Genesis has constantly been blessing the blessed one. And what you got was Eden abundance in a time of famine. And so the Pharaoh of the Exodus story with Moses is definitely a contrast character to his counterpart Pharaoh at the end of Genesis. And so here it's an example. It's Genesis 12:3. I'll bless those who bless you. That's the Pharaoh at the end of Genesis. I will bring curse on those who treat you as cursed. And that's the Pharaoh of the Exodus story. So there's all kinds of parallels. I haven't read David Foreman's book, so I'm glad to know about it. But I had noticed that contrast portrait too. And it's a cool way because it links together the two scrolls. Genesis and Exodus have a little mirror contrast.
They're on two different
scrolls,
but you're supposed to think of them as connected works.
Yeah. So the first Exodus out of the land was a good one with blessing for Pharaoh. And there's a little detail in Genesis that the Egyptian procession with Jacob was with Pharaoh and his officers and his horsemen. And it reads like the Pharaoh and his chariots and officers that chase after Israel that meet their doom.
That's cool to think about what the later Pharaoh could have done.
Yeah.
By meditating back on that.
Yeah. In other words, when you see the Pharaoh who challenges Moses, what you ought to say is, oh, no, this could have gone one of two ways.
Yeah.
And it didn't have to go this way, but because he hardens his heart, it went the way of curse and death. So great observation. I'm glad to know about David Foreman's work on that. I'm going to check that out.
Hey, to piggyback on that, it's a little bit different. The wording of the request is usually something around, we just want to go in the wilderness and
3 days.
Yeah, 3 days.
And make a sacrifice to our God.
Yeah, we're just going to have a little ritual.
Yes.
And then you kind of get a sense of and then we'll come back, we'll be slaves again. It almost feels kind of like a trick.
Yeah. Actually, we have many questions about that.
Oh, okay, great.
But no, actually, we have many questions about that, but they weren't repeated as often as some of these other ones. So,
okay.
So I'll just say, I think it is a trick.
Okay.
Yeah. It fits into the pattern of counter deceptions. Pharaoh acted skillfully with craftiness in chapter 1, and he starts enacting all these plans to destroy and to kill. And there's this pattern at work from the Genesis scroll of when people make a plan that will result in death, often the way to deal with a schemer is to counter scheme.
Kind of like the
Hebrew midwives.
Exactly.
So what Moses is doing with Pharaoh and saying hey, we'll just go 3 days out, is set on parallelism to the Hebrew midwives that don't do Pharaoh's command.
Cool. All right. Yeah. Let's get to our listeners.
Okay. Next question is from Jana in Indiana.
Hi, Tim and John. This is Jana Harden. I'm from Marion, Indiana. My question is about Exodus 4, verses 24 through 26. Moses is headed back to Egypt, and it says the Lord met him and was going to kill him, but then his wife circumcised his son and saved his life, I think. I'm just confused why God would say he's going to kill Moses when he's just told him to go back and save his people. Thanks for all you do, guys.
It is such a
such a good story.
It's such you're cruising down the highway and then all of a sudden just what the heck was that story all about?
Totally. So good. Okay, first of all, this was the most repeated question.
Okay.
Yes. A lot.
Yeah.
And for very good reason. It's a jarring little story.
Yeah.
And it's a great example of a short, super dense riddle-like story woven in to a much bigger like narrative section in the Hebrew Bible. And this happens often. They're almost like little parable riddles that are so confusing, it forces you to look to the surrounding narrative for greater understanding. So this little story is all about narrative patterning, leading back to the death of the death of the firstborn son theme going on through Genesis, or the loss of the beloved son.
This is also an origin story of circumcision, a little bit?
No,
No, okay.
But it's related to it. So within the narrative itself, there's an important design strategy in Exodus chapters 1 through 6, where Moses will go through as an individual what the whole nation is going to go through in chapters 6 through 15. So Moses is delivered out of the waters in chapter 1.
Oh, yeah.
Moses is delivered out from among a death of all of the sons. Moses goes up to Mount Sinai and sees God at the fiery bush and is afraid and hides his face. Moses goes out into the wilderness and discovers a well there where God provides for him. So Moses, all of a sudden, in chapters 1 through 4, it's clear that Moses is living out himself what is going to happen to all of the people. So this story right here in Exodus 4 is reflecting on Moses's complex identity. Is he a Hebrew or is he an Egyptian? And he's both.
Well, he's technically a Hebrew.
He's a Hebrew.
But he
becomes
brought up
yeah.
as an Egyptian.
Yeah, he becomes a son of Pharaoh, a son of Pharaoh's daughter, and is given an Egyptian name. And so when we come to the story in Exodus 4, what it raises the question is about circumcision. And what's not clear, actually, is whether God was going to kill Moses or God was going to kill Moses' firstborn son, Gershom. The language, it could be either. So that's interesting. What's interesting is that when Moses' wife comes, she doesn't circumcise Moses. What she circumcises is his firstborn son.
Oh, okay.
And then takes the foreskin and touches it to Moses. Okay, so here's what's happening. Moses is going through his family is going through a pre-Passover Passover. So just like he went through the waters.
In the baby ark.
In the baby ark. Just like he went through himself what all of Israel is going to go through. Here, do you remember, it's an interesting feature of Passover that God says, I'm going to strike all firstborn among human and beast in Egypt, including Israelite.
Right.
Like it's just going to be an indiscriminate flood of a plague through the land. And so even Israelites need to be rescued through the blood of a Passover lamb. And what the Israelites are to do is to take the blood and they are to touch it to the door. And Yahweh looks at the blood as a sign of surrender and trust and doesn't allow death to enter that house. So within the Exodus narrative, this is Moses experiencing himself a surrender to the will and command of God. But notice that it's his wife who saves his life.
Yeah.
Because he didn't do it. So Moses here, it's once again, Moses' life has been saved by the two important women in his life now for the second time.
What was the first time?
Well, his mom.
Oh.
His mom.
Put him in the basket.
Yeah, rescued him from death.
Yeah.
And now here his wife is rescuing him or his son from death. So that's one piece. But the second piece is, well, why would God kill him? This is right after he said, you're my guy to rescue the people. So I think here we're all narrative patterning back to the Abraham story. And notice Genesis 16 and 17, back to Abraham and Hagar again. That story is so important. God said, I'm going to give you a son. Abraham and Sarah don't trust. They sexually abuse and impregnate their Egyptian slave and then oppress her and abuse her. And God's judgment on Abraham is chapter 17, circumcision. And it's both judgment and mercy. So he tells Abraham, the sign of the covenant, now that you have wronged the Egyptian, will be to cut off a part of your genitals that you just used to oppress your slave. So it's judgment. But it also, that cutting off of the foreskin is precisely on the part of the body from which Abraham will make his contribution to Sarah's womb for the future of their family.
Right.
And then what God says is anyone who wants to be a part of this family of Abraham, whether he's born into your house or whether he is an immigrant or slave purchased into your house, they have to be circumcised. And if they are not, they will be cut off from their people. So God takes seriously this command that this is a family whose very existence and identity is both a mark of God's justice and mercy. And so I think what we're seeing here is that Moses either wasn't himself circumcised, or I think more likely his firstborn son wasn't circumcised, which means he stood under the threat of death by God's command from Genesis 17. And so Moses neglects to obey the command of God to mark his son as a part of the covenant family. And so, but his wife gets it. And so I think that's how circumcision fits in.
His wife gets it, but she's not even Hebrew.
And she's not even Hebrew. That's exactly the point. So you have a non-Israelite who gets the covenant more than the covenant mediator does.
Wow.
And this is Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other side of all of this, in Exodus 18, we have Jethro, a non-Israelite, who's going to be rescuing Moses from workaholism. So you have all these points where these non-Israelites are delivering God's people, and that they can somehow see the covenant more clearly than God's old covenant people can. Anyway, so that story in Exodus 4 is meant to make you like slam on the brakes and meditate on this, all the stories around, to give you insight into the puzzles.
You mentioned this circumcision insight once before, and I'm really glad we had a chance to circle back to it, because it's such a powerful image of the part of our body that generates life.
Part of a male body.
Part of a male body that generates life.
Yeah.
Which is part of the blessing of humanity.
Yes, yes.
Multiply, have life, abundance. But then also is something that becomes such a tool of oppression. And for God to mark that and say, like, in a very physical way, like this, if you're going to be my people, out of all the things he's going to choose, like that's the thing.
That's the thing.
That's
a part of the male body that can either be used to generate life and covenant blessing. It can also be a tool of oppression and abuse.
Yeah.
That's what Genesis 16 and 17 are meditating on.
Wow.
And so to be a part of the messianic family of God's people holds a high degree of focus on what men do with their genitals and accountability before God of what God's male covenant partners do with their genitals. And Jesus clearly shared that passionate focus in the Sermon on the Mount, which is why he singles out men, for example, particularly in the command about lust and adultery and
And so when we get to that story, that's in our mind that this is an important part of being a part of the covenant people. But I love this other insight that you brought, which is this was Moses's Passover moment as well.
Pre-Passover.
It's like
Passover.
a pre-Passover.
Yeah, for just him and his family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so fascinating.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yep. And again, the hyperlinks is the actual language at work. Blood and touching of the blood is precisely the same vocabulary used about the blood being touched to the door for Passover.
Okay. Good. So we'll catch there. So there's two. So I guess the point is the questions begin. So Terry Evans brings up the connection between the Exodus narrative, and Joseph's burial. Okay. I got to applaud Terry and glad he not only heard of, but I hope enjoyed the book, The Exodus You Passed Over, from Rabbi David Foreman. So I guess in these things, even without that, do we see these connections? Do we see the connections? And inherently, when you get asked that question, sometimes we look back on it, and when we were reading through it in our years past, we weren't going, "Oh yes, there's parallels between those two." That wasn't the first thing that leaps to mind, right? But so Tim's response is yes and yes, right? So here maybe is interesting question maybe to ask, and for sure it's contextual in this, is when do we see a pattern, right? And that's a real question. When do you see a pattern? Is it after 2, 3, 4, 5 times that you might notice? Maybe a more relevant question is, do we see them? And then if we do they apply to ourselves or only to others, right? Do we see ourselves in the loop of these patterns? Or do we only see others and not ourselves in these patterns? Again, how many times do we need to see something before we see that pattern? Complicated questions. So let's add another wrinkle to the complicated question, and let's extend the time frame. Okay. What I mean by that is that these patterns that are played out over years, even generations. Okay. So this is a bit of a rabbi trail, so indulge me a bit. Okay. There are also other words we use to express patterns, right? Habits, customs, traditions, addictions. So in other words here, at least in our current thought process, these patterns can transcend individual behavior and also possibly cultural boundaries, right? We tend maybe to put them in categories with connotations like addictions or bad patterns, right? But yet we can have good habits and bad habits, traditions and customs, tend to transcend not just time, but as a family, for instance, starts a tradition, it might continue and it might not. Communities have them, and they use them to connect individuals into their community. There's a pendulum swing I often hear and see and have experienced with traditions. As we shift from another denomination or a group, and I see it quite often in our messianic groups with this term, stop following the traditions of men, right? And it probably stems from the thought that certain practices, traditions or customs that are referenced in Scripture, that are pointed out maybe as not so good, and then that all of the traditions are associated or practiced by that said group or person, that all of those are bad as well. And we know that that might be a problem on multiple fronts, as in, let's use ourselves as an example and say Shabbat, let's say Sabbath. So that comes loaded with traditions, customs, practices, right? We've had these passed down generations for millennia, and they've evolved through this centuries, right? History. Somewhere along the line, some folks decided that it needed to be moved, Sabbath needed to be moved from Sunday to Saturday. And it was probably after they had decided that there was church gatherings, and then these church gatherings that held, we need to move them to another day, right? So, I guess we'll have to have a Sabbath episode, at least one, probably soon. But this really has nothing to do with that on the Sabbath episode. What I'm talking about is all of its traditions and customs and practices that go on, whether you're a Saturday or Sunday, right? Along with that, what we do when we gather inside of those. So many things. So let's just be careful as we address, examine traditions, customs, practices, to really look at things as we start to learn and reveal possibly a different way of doing things. Okay. And keep this question in the back of your mind because it'll come back many times. Who told you it was that way? Who told you? Passed down. And if you're willing to go back and look and say, okay, if somebody said, well, we've been doing this, the church does this, blah, blah, blah. So we keep going back and said, when to go back and how to go back. So maybe how far are you comfortable going back to get the answer? That could prove to be a challenge. Yes. How far are you willing to get back? And then are you prepared for the answer? Are you prepared for an answer that maybe will be challenging that you're not comfortable with? Okay. Okay, so let's get back to the questions between Joseph and the Exodus, right? One of the things that Tim regularly points is repetitive language, which is very important. And he also points out that the words in our English translations can, at times, be a challenge to missing these exact patterns. So many of my times with Rabbi David Foreman in his studies, he puts up on his screen and he highlights not only the repetitive verbiage, but also the spelling nuances that are part of of Hebrew wordplay. And he'll take and he pulls them up on the screen with Zoom, and he highlights these repetitive patterns, and so you can see them. See, because we look for different English words to fill in different things, and so we're not necessarily going to see a pattern of that same phrase used again and again and again. We've said it here a number of times that quote unquote Hebrew in its sense is bad English, right? Hebrew in its sense bad English because it keeps repeating phrases. However, it's very, very good Hebrew. And what's interesting is even when Foreman is speaking it and he's teaching these courses and he speaks, I can't understand Hebrew, but I can hear the repetition. It's like a poem. It's like a lyric. It's there's a lilt to it, or a word where I go, ooh, that sounds related, and then they go, yeah, it's the same, except that the same. For instance, a lot of the time you hear the same consonants, so it's written exactly the same way. So until the Masoretes did their vowelization pointers, it was written the same, but it's pronounced differently because of the vowel pointers. And you only knew that because somebody had passed on the story and tell it to you. You don't get that, and we miss those nuances and that wordplay that goes with it with our English. And then I suppose, I guess maybe we have the danger of missing these entirely, and it's a pity because there's so much more we need to learn, see, hear. Maybe it's one of those parts of seek and ye shall find. That's very old English, ye shall find. Because we're so far down the river that we've missed so much that maybe we need to relearn things, maybe things that have been lost. I've heard that phrase with people, especially older, in that sense, is that somebody will be referencing somebody in a very positive way and go, they've forgotten more than I already know. So maybe we need to relearn what was forgotten. the comparisons with this question are very good examples of this. It really is a very good question to ask. How many of these stories are pattern connected? How many of these have overlapping patterns? And as Tim and John point out, believe this, all of these patterns lead to and are connected to Jesus, Yeshua. Okay. Side note, before I forget, there was a graphic that showed up on the screen during the question discussion around the 32:45 mark. So if you stop the video after we're done and you go back and look on the screen at when Tim and John are talking, and I started at about 30 minutes. So it's a 30-minute mark. So only a couple of minutes after that it shows up on the podcast screen. And they have it up and it's teleos. Okay. And this is where we get that things are Jesus came to fulfill, right? Translations: maturity, accomplishment, fulfillment, definitions: complete or perfect. So I want to remind you that we'll get to this discussion. We will. Not today, because that's not one of the questions, but we'll get this at a later time as well. So what do we have? Sabbath and teleos that will be coming up because we really want to address those. Okay, so back. So these two stories are paralleled yet contrast, kind of like an inverted pattern, right? Remember, there's a scene in Top Gun where Maverick is chasing after some Soviet MiGs, and they're flying around, and the point where the Soviet MiG had lost him. He's trying to figure out what to do, and he had come over and flew over and was inverted over above him, and he looked up. The guy and pilot looked up. They looked up their way, which would be down, and they thought they were the same thing, just inverted. And when my picture about inverted patterns, I pictured these two jets flying this way, and it was interesting for my crazy head. So one of these played out. One of the stories played out with a very positive outcome. And remember, with Joseph, they went to eat. They went out of Egypt, buried, and then came back. Okay, they returned. Now, how it played out with a negative outcome, we have the Exodus story. It would have been interesting to see how the story might have played out if Pharaoh had let them go with Moses in the original request at the very beginning, the very first times that he asks. Remember, they were supposed to go out, meet with, worship God, and then return. What that might have looked like, I guess we'll never know, okay? But here's the thing. Tim and John are discussing the craftiness of Pharaoh and the counter scheme of God. And how did that sit with you? It didn't sit with me. That God would instruct Moses, at least in the beginning of these requests, to take the children out for 3 days. But Tim implies that God had no intention of having the children of Israel come back. Is this then a lie to Pharaoh? Is Pharaoh then maybe valid in his wanting them not to leave? Right? That's an uncomfortable thought, and probably need some more coffee and time to discuss that one. The promise that God made to Abraham did play true. Not sure the people living in the moment at the time actually saw it that way, that God would bless those that bless these promised people, as in the Joseph story. When they're living out the Joseph story, are they saying, oh, this is that promise? I'm not sure that they're seeing it in that moment. And then the curse those that curse these same people. Again, God keeping his promise. Obviously, they didn't see that, but are they seeing that other point? Again, I'm not convinced by the narrative that these people saw it that way when they were in the moment. that everything we do is a backwards view, that revelation for sure. That's why we have the feasts. That's why we have Sukkot with the temporary dwellings, where God is telling them to look back, see these stories, hear these stories, and see my hands, my fingerprints, my footprints, my imprint, my patterns in these stories, and then remember them. And every year with Sukkot would be the temporary dwellings. That would be that time in the wilderness to remember these events, right? So for us, how many kinds of these moments have we had and not realized, especially being in the moment? But at times, like my mom will say, do we take the time to even stop and look back and see whether we even see those moments? Do we stop at the end of the day and say, thank you for those moments? And then do I begin my day with, help me see those moments? Since I'm the persuasion that we are still in the story, I've shared this before, then maybe, what pattern might I be a part of? Which of the past patterns might I be repeating? Parallel but inverse? Good choice, bad choice? A redemptive pattern? We're starting to notice these connections now, right? And so now that we are, and those other people, those other followers, those are the children of God, that we've been told through our church history, tragically enough, through teachings, to ignore them at best, and at worst, persecute, right? They've been seeing these patterns for centuries, probably millennia, but I'll safe with centuries. So are we in any part of that treatment culpable to those that curse these same people? And in that, do we think that we're immune to God's justice and his promise? Food for thought. I myself am incredibly grateful to be able to learn and grow with these brothers and sisters, Brother Judah, who has, they both of us follow this amazing God. Yes, a bit different. And I might even say without just cause. Yet so much can be shared between us that can only make us both stronger, at least in our faith for sure, and definitely in our understanding. Again, I want to thank Rabbi David Foreman and the team at Aleph Beta for all they do to rethink and express the Torah. To Tim and John and the folks at Bible Project for doing the exact same thing. Common cause, for sure. Okay, next question. Jana's question. I like this. Jana's question from Exodus 4, 24 through 26, right? About Moses' circumcision story with Zipporah, right? There's even another story there, but we won't even get to there to connect. But that's hence the title of this whole episode. Remember, did God try to kill Moses? I was actually surprised to hear that this was the number one reviewed asked question to them, right? This was the number one question. So John brings up the point. He says, you're cruising along, meaning he's referring to reading scripture, and you're cruising along the highway, and then, you slam on the brakes. Where did that come from? So Tim goes into the point that this kind of literary element is common in the Hebrew scriptures, right? These short parable riddles, right, as he called them, that seem so confusing that it forces us to look to the surrounding narratives for greater understanding, right? But before I get to mention this kind of short parable puzzle thought, in a way, we can see it in the gospel scrolls and the letters, right? And then there's, in those confusing points, we have elements that are taken out of a greater literary context, and then that we can make them confusing or misleading out of context for sure. So let's remember this type of thinking when we continue our studies. Fair? So Tim goes on to say that this falls into a dense literary pattern, right? So I have another God moment, right? Maybe as I'm drawing up my notes for this, and I came across a video, that Carmen Imes video, and I learned she had a YouTube channel, Torah Tuesday. The link is in the description, not only to this video we're going to look at, but to her channel as well. I'm seeing her channel as a useful resource as well. Okay. So, and the reason I want to show this video is she specifically talks about, in this, it just came up that it addresses this question, and it's a new video that it addresses this exact reference, question, point in scripture. So enjoy the video with Carmen Imes. Oh, in the beginning, she's intros her book, and to a Spanish audience, it's real short, so just breathe through it. The video is only like 7 minutes, so it's short, but you'll enjoy what you hear, and then we'll talk about it afterwards.
Hello, and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. Before we start, I have a quick announcement for my Spanish-speaking viewers. Si hablas español, tengo buenas noticias. Mi libro, Bearing God's Name, ha sido traducido al español. Portadores de su nombre, la importancia del Sinaí. Puede ver los videos de Torah Tuesday con subtítulos en español haciendo clic en el botón CC debajo del video y seleccionando español. Disfrutas! Okay, for this week, we are continuing our study of Exodus in chapter 4. And before we dive into the details of what is one of the most difficult and mysterious passages in the entire book of Exodus, I thought we should take a moment to step back and look at a little bit bigger picture. So we're looking at verses 18 to 31, and I've planned at least 4 more videos on the sections of this. So we'll get down into more granular detail. But first, I'm hoping to convince you that we need to read these verses as a unit, that they're a tightly constructed literary unit. And I think the reason why we have so much trouble with verses 24 to 26, the strange circumcision story where God is trying to kill Moses and Zipporah saves his life, we struggle with that because we've failed to see how the whole unit is tightly constructed, and because we fail to see how this unit functions in the book as a whole. So in the next mini-series of videos, we're going to be diving into these difficult texts. I find them so fascinating. So first today, I just want to show you some of the connections between these sections of verses 18 through 31. So you could go through your Bible, through these verses, and just see if you can sort of chunk them into scenes. And if you put them in scenes, we've got at least 4 different scenes, as many as 6 scenes that are all kind of rapid fire back to back, just short vignettes back to back. And what I find fascinating is that there are lots of textual links between the scenes. And so although it seems like different things are happening, there's words that connect them. So I'm just going to run through a list of some of these connections. And if you've gone through your text and broken them into paragraphs, you can sort of draw lines between them and see just how interconnected they are. So if you want to pause the video, make paragraphs, and then unpause when you're ready, I'll be waiting. Okay, so in verse 18, Moses says he's going to return to Egypt. And in verse 19, Yahweh tells Moses to return to Egypt. So there's an obvious link. But there are also links in these verses that are based on Hebrew words that might not come through in English. So for example, in verse 18, Moses is speaking with his father-in-law, Jethro. And the word for father-in-law in Hebrew is choten. In verse 25, after Zipporah performs the circumcision, she says, "You've become a bridegroom of blood to me." That word bridegroom is the word chatan. So we have choten, chatan, the same consonants, just different vocalization, different vowels. So those two are linked. Verse 19 speaks of the commission of Moses. Verse 27 speaks of the commission of Aaron in very similar terms. Verse 22 talks about the firstborn of Yahweh. Verse 23 talks about the firstborn of Pharaoh. So those are linked. In verse 19, Pharaoh seeks to kill Moses, or Pharaoh had sought to kill Moses. In verse 24, Yahweh sought to kill Moses. So those are clearly linked. Verse 23 speaks about Pharaoh's son. Verse 24 speaks about Moses' son. In verse 24, Yahweh encounters Moses using the verb pagash. And in verse 27, Aaron encounters Moses using the verb pagash. This one is especially fun because it's a relatively rare word and it's used in exactly the same form. Vayifgashehu. Vayifgashehu is the word for "and he met him." So it's the exact same form in verse 24 and verse 27. And then the word that follows that, he met him and what, is like a rhyming word in these two scenes. So in verse 24, Yahweh vayifkashehu Moses vayavakesh, and he sought to kill him. And in verse 27, Aaron vayifkashehu's Moses vayishak, and he kisses him. So vayavakesh and vayishak are the same, has the same two key consonants, the sheen and the kof, and they have them in reverse order. So what we have is this brilliant narrator putting these two scenes side by side in which Yahweh encounters Moses and seeks to kill him, and then Aaron encounters Moses and kisses him, and the two sound alike, and sandwiched in the middle is the turning point of the whole narrative where Zipporah saves the day and circumcises. And so Moses' life is no longer in danger. And you can see that his life is no longer in danger because when his brother meets him, he doesn't seek to kill him, he kisses him. So there's this really cool play going on behind the scenes. See why you need to learn Hebrew? It's so much fun. Couple of other connections that link these scenes together. In verse 18, Moses says that he intends to see his brothers in Egypt. And then verses 27 to 31 are the resolution of that. Moses and his brother Aaron see the Israelites in Egypt. So there's the resolution of his intention from verse 18. Verse 20 mentions Moses' wife and sons, and verse 25 mentions his wife and son, like they play into the narrative there. So all of these links, and there are others that you could perhaps find as well, all these links between the different scenes in this tightly constructed unit shows us that we ought to be reading this together. And in future weeks, we're gonna zoom in on each of these scenes and see what we can learn from what's happening and how this is functioning in the larger message of the book, so that it can help us see how the narrator wants us to understand this strange scene. Because if we just read it by itself, it's very bizarre. But if we read it in context of the entire book, it's illuminating. And I can't wait to show you how. Have a great week.
You know, it's interesting that verse where Torah, I've seen it translated for somebody on those nice feel good quotes I want to do, and your word rather than Torah, when it's actually Torah, which is important because it's specific, but we tend to miss that. So I hope you enjoyed her. I do. She's turning out to be quite a resource. Like, why am I surprised? It's not. So we get a brief glimpse into the connections and how the language and the letters even play a part in the context of the story, right? So thank you, Carmen. That I appreciate. So Tim shares the story connections about how Moses, as an individual, will go through the same, and I'll use the word patterns, that the children of Israel will go through. His life and things that he's done are a microcosm of a macrocosm, right? You're looking at this and he's going through this and to be. So you're going to see these connections extrapolated. They get bigger, right? And that's kind of like Abraham, and he starts out small and then it gets bigger, right? So the extrapolation of the pattern, the extrapolation of a lot of things tend to play out. And Tim points out that Moses is both a Hebrew and an Egyptian. Really, maybe also a mirror of Joseph, because Joseph is the same, a Hebrew, and very much an Egyptian, right? Okay, and it's not clear, at least in the original language for sure, who was supposed to be killed. We get it in the context, but so you're getting for a second, is it Moses or is it Gershon? Ambiguous language, something to make us pay attention and wrestle with. Yet in the bigger picture, more of a macro view, when you pull back and the patterning we see, maybe we can see a bit more. Slow down. Slow down. Like you're reading through the story. Like I said, you're racing down the highway, and then all of a sudden this thing jumps out at you, right? That doesn't belong there for whatever reason, and we get this. So slow down. And then when you're doing that, don't get too focused on this item. It says, look at the scenery. So is it out of context where you're racing down? Is it really out of context in the scenery? Let's just say you race down the highway and you race into, and all of a sudden there's a cow on the highway. You don't expect a cow on the highway. You're like, oh my God, you hit the brakes, and you go down and then you stop. Slow down. Look around, see what else is going on. And you go, I'm the one out of the context, meaning my highway is splitting right through farmland and right through a spot where a cow could or should be. And he's out of context in my lane of space, but he's not out of context in the bigger picture. Maybe my thinking is out of context. That's something to chew on, right? There's so many overlapping patterns in these narratives that are cool to look at, like Carmen said, laid out, right? So many connections. So that said, so Tim does continue to go to a point that now I don't personally agree with, and that's that Abraham abused his Egyptian maidservant. But then he goes on to say that the circumcision is a punishment consequence from God, justice and mercy. And I'm not sure I agree here. It's an interesting thought to say that your punishment will be a mark on all of your descendants as a covenant promise to you and all of your generations, using your punishment as a reminder. I'm not sure the narrative reflects that. Some covenants do require blood, but not as a punishment, but as a reflector of the importance and the life attachment, life in the blood, and the life attachment of the covenant. I'm personally not persuaded by the use of the Hagar and the punishment, right? The covenant mark is part of this. And so we will all suffer the same punishment of Abraham to be part of this community. Again, I'm not sure I see that in the narrative. I don't see any connecting patterns. But that's the challenging nature of scripture and study, to see what we see and connect what we see to connect. Like we said last week, it taught me that someone's opposition view is theirs for more reasons than the points to be made. And part of our position is like what Tim said, the nature of human knowledge is that we're finite, right? We can only bring our current thinking. In other words, what's going on in the moment, right? And that's mood, reflection, all kinds of things that are in the current moment. And the sum of my life experience, my individual life experience. And I can only bring that to bear on anything, right? To make sense of anything, scripture, life, anything. We're all in that, right? And it can lead you a couple of ways, right? It could compel you to change your paradigm thinking, and it compel you to stay in your thought. His personal caution, again, I will agree with, and I liked, that we need to hold our convictions with a degree of openness, that we're ready, always ready to learn from others. It forms people to both focus and develop their thinking, and to make sense of scripture and to make sense of life, really, at the same time with an openness and a humility to know that I am almost always certainly missing something. And I need the whole community. I need the whole community of God's people to move towards a greater understanding. It's a very interesting point that Tim brings up, and I love this, about non-Israelite people grasping God. In this one, right, Zipporah with the incident elements and the covenant not being accomplished yet with Gershon, right, that he hadn't been circumcised, right? And this is maybe grasping God as a whole. Then we have Jethro, a Midianite, and his examples with that, and he helps him, like Tim said, not be a workaholic. The Midianite connection, right? You want to see an overlapping Midianite connection pattern, that's where we get to Melchizedek. Okay, is the Midianite connection. So a non-Israelite and a priestly non-Israelite getting God and sharing that with others around. So obviously there's other people around there that also believe in this God, right? In our God. We're just getting the story about these people in their time, in this time, right? And what's going with it, where God is taking them and the promises that he made and his commitment to those promises as we move forward. But we have smattered throughout non-Israelites that are connected to God and seeing God. And a couple times here, right, in these were pointed out that they're getting it. And understand, these are individuals getting it. And the weird comparison we always do is they got it, but the group of the people didn't. And I go, well, that's interesting, because that's probably the truth, in that some people, the individual gets it, but sometimes the bigger group doesn't, at least in the beginning, right? We have this with, so let's race forward, right? Let's take the connection. We race forward to Yeshua's time frame, and a certain Roman centurion, he saw, he heard, he understood, while many around didn't yet. Another part of a pattern. Another part of a pattern. Okay. Point to ponder to wrap it up, right? Point to ponder. So I love the points to ponder. So this one's interesting because I'm going to counter something in here, which is always fun. I reserve the right on the Dusty Feet. So identifying the pattern is awareness. Choosing not to repeat the cycle is growth. Okay. Remember we talked about connotations to things before? So the implication here is that identifying the pattern is awareness, choosing not to repeat the pattern. So assuming that the pattern is negative. Okay. So I kind of want to encourage us maybe to turn this one upside down, like I like to think, right? And go identifying the pattern is awareness. Choosing to repeat the cycle is growth. Identifying the good pattern is awareness. Choosing to repeat the cycle is growth. But thank you, Billy Chapta, for making us think. And thanks for being with us tonight again on the Dusty Feet.